Close your eyes for a moment and imagine the sound of distant helicopters, the dense weight of humid air, and the endless stretch of jungle all around you. Picture a time when nations were divided, when families were torn apart, and when young men and women were sent into a conflict that would shape history on both sides of the world. Tonight, we are going to walk together through the long, complicated story of the Vietnam War. Its causes, its battles, and its far-reaching consequences. Before we begin, I'd like to invite you to take a deep breath, settle into a comfortable place, and let your mind drift into the past. This channel is here to bring you calm and immersive journeys into history. If you enjoy these stories, please consider liking this video and subscribing to the channel. It helps us share more of these thoughtful explorations with you. And if there are other stories from history you'd like us to tell, please leave a comment below. Your ideas help shape the journeys we take together. Now, sit back, relax, and allow the story to unfold. A story of war, of memory, and of the people whose lives were forever changed by the struggle in Vietnam. Part 1. Shadows of Empire. The story of the Vietnam War does not begin in the jungles where American troops fought in the 1960s. Nor does it begin with the Cold War standoff between Washington and Moscow. Its origins lie far deeper in time, in the long centuries when Vietnam was shaped by outside powers yet constantly found ways to assert its independence. To understand why the conflict grew into one of the defining struggles of the 20th century, we must first look at a land whose history is marked by both foreign control and unyielding resistance. Vietnam lies along the eastern edge of the Southeast Asian mainland, a narrow strip of fertile valleys pressed between mountains and the South China Sea. Its geography gave it both vulnerability and resilience. Invaders could reach it from the sea or march down from the north, but once there, they faced thick forests, high ridges, and a people hardened by centuries of defending their homeland. For more than 1,000 years, Vietnam lived under varying degrees of Chinese domination, absorbing cultural practices, Confucian ideas, and systems of writing and governance. Yet despite those influences, the Vietnamese preserved a strong sense of their own identity. Folk tales, religious practices, and oral traditions reminded them that they were not merely an extension of China but a people with their own destiny. The rhythm of village life, centered on rice cultivation in the Red River Delta, created continuity even when foreign dynasties claimed authority. When European colonial ambitions reached Asia in the 16th and 17th centuries, Vietnam was drawn into a new cycle of entanglements. Traders, missionaries, and explorers began to arrive, bringing new ideas and technologies but also the shadow of conquest. Among the most determined outsiders were the French. By the early 19th century, France had already established colonies in Africa and the Caribbean and was looking eastward. The lure of Vietnam was strong: fertile land for rice and rubber, strategic harbors that opened onto the South China Sea, and a location that gave access to wider markets in China. Catholic missionaries had also created footholds in Vietnamese society, which French officials later used as a justification for intervention, claiming the need to protect religious converts. The decisive step toward colonization came in the mid-19th century. In 1858, French naval forces attacked the port of A with grave NNG, citing the execution of missionaries as their pretext. After years of campaigns, treaties, and expanding control, France established a protectorate over Vietnam and merged it with neighboring Cambodia and Laos. The new entity was called French Indochina. From the French perspective, it was a triumph of empire. From the Vietnamese perspective, it was the beginning of a long struggle against foreign rule. Life under colonial administration was harsh. The French reorganized the economy around their own needs, turning vast areas of fertile land into plantations for rice, coffee, and rubber. Taxes were raised, and peasants often lost their fields to wealthy landlords aligned with the colonial authorities. Those who once worked their own small plots found themselves laboring for low wages on plantations, forced to meet quotas that provided wealth for faraway investors in Paris rather than food for their families. Infrastructure such as railways, roads, and ports were built, but they were designed to move raw materials to ships, not to improve the lives of local communities. The colonial regime relied heavily on a small class of collaborators, landlords, bureaucrats, and officials who benefited from aligning themselves with French power. This created new divisions within Vietnamese society, widening the gap between the rich who could profit from colonial connections and the poor who carried the burden of taxes and forced labor. Resistance simmered quietly at first. Peasant uprisings broke out in villages, often brutally crushed. Intellectuals and nationalists debated how Vietnam could break free, some calling for modernization along Western lines, others seeking a return to traditional values. By the late 19th century, resentment was growing into organized movements. Nationalist groups formed among educated elites, many of whom studied abroad and returned with radical ideas about independence and self-determination. They drew inspiration from other colonized peoples around the world, as well as from the principles of liberty and equality that France itself proclaimed but denied to its colonial subjects. Underground networks circulated pamphlets, organized meetings, and began to imagine a Vietnam free of foreign domination. French authorities responded with repression. Censorship, imprisonment, and executions were common. Yet even as the colonial state sought to crush dissent, every act of resistance left an impression. Martyrs were remembered, their names passed down as symbols of courage. Villages carried quiet pride in those who dared to defy authority. Over time, a culture of resistance began to take root. The 20th century brought new pressures. Global markets demanded ever more rice and rubber, increasing the exploitation of laborers. At the same time, modern ideas spread faster, carried by students, travelers, and political activists. Among them was a young man named Nguyen Sinh Kung, later known as H. Chi Minh. Born in 1890, he left Vietnam as a young adult and traveled widely, absorbing the politics of Europe and America. In France, he witnessed socialist and communist movements, and he came to believe that Vietnam's liberation could only come through revolutionary struggle. His ideas would later play a central role in the story of Vietnam's 20th century wars. The First World War added fuel to the fire. France conscripted tens of thousands of Vietnamese laborers and soldiers to serve in Europe. They dug trenches, worked in factories, and even fought on the front lines. When they returned home, they brought with them both trauma and a sharper sense of injustice. They had bled for France, yet their own country remained in chains. In the years after the war, nationalist protests grew louder. Demonstrations erupted in major cities. Peasants resisted taxes more openly. Strikes began to spread among workers in plantations and factories. The French colonial regime, fearful of losing control, responded with renewed repression. Yet the very act of suppressing dissent often strengthened the cause of independence. Leaders who were jailed became symbols of the struggle. Executions created martyrs. Secret societies flourished, keeping alive the dream of self-rule. By the 1930s, the crisis deepened further. The Great Depression devastated the global economy, and Vietnam was no exception. Rice prices collapsed, yet taxes remained high. Starvation spread across the countryside, leaving families destitute. The suffering pushed many into the arms of revolutionary movements that promised land reform and equality. The Indo-Chinese Communist Party, founded under the guidance of H. Chi Minh, gained momentum during these years, presenting itself as the most determined force for liberation. France, meanwhile, clung to its colony. Officials in Paris argued that Indochina was essential to French prestige as a world power. They ignored the rising tide of nationalism, dismissing it as the work of agitators or criminals. Yet beneath the surface, Vietnamese society was changing. A generation was growing up that had known nothing but colonial rule, and for many, resistance was not just an option but a duty. The outbreak of the Second World War altered the balance once again. In 1940, when France fell to Nazi Germany, its colonial empire was thrown into uncertainty. Japan, seeking resources and strategic positions for its expansion across Asia, moved into Indochina with the consent of the collaborationist Vichy government. For the Vietnamese, this meant that one foreign occupier had been replaced by another. French administrators remained in place, but real power rested with the Japanese army. Conditions worsened dramatically. The Japanese exploited Vietnam's resources to fuel their war machine, seizing rice and other supplies. In 1944 and 1945, famine swept through northern Vietnam, killing perhaps 2 million people. Families starved in the fields while warehouses of grain were shipped away. The horror of this famine would leave deep scars and would later become a rallying cry for revolutionaries who promised never again to let their people die in such numbers under foreign rule. During this period of occupation, resistance movements gained new urgency. Among them, the Viet Minh, led by H. Chi Minh, emerged as the most organized and effective. They combined nationalist goals with communist ideology, promising independence, land reform, and an end to exploitation. The Viet Minh operated in the countryside, building support among peasants and organizing guerrilla units. Their message was simple but powerful. Vietnam belonged to the Vietnamese, not to the French or the Japanese. When Japan surrendered in August 1945, the opportunity for change arrived. The Viet Minh quickly seized the moment, launching what became known as the August Revolution. They took control of Hanoi and other major cities, declaring the independence of the Democratic Republic of Vietnam. H. Chi Minh, in a speech that echoed the American Declaration of Independence, proclaimed that all men were created equal and that Vietnam would no longer be enslaved. For a brief period, it seemed that centuries of foreign domination might finally end. But the struggle was far from over. The French, backed by their allies, were not ready to let go of Indochina. Within months, they returned with troops, determined to reassert their authority. The seeds of the First Indochina War were planted, and the cycle of conflict would continue. The Vietnam War of the 1960s and 70s would one day draw in the full power of the United States, but its roots lay in these earlier decades of colonialism and resistance. The French conquest of the 19th century, the exploitation of the colonial economy, the hunger and repression of the early 20th century, the famine under Japanese rule, and the bold declaration of independence in 1945. All of these moments shaped the trajectory that led Vietnam into 30 years of near-continuous war. For the Vietnamese people, the struggle against foreign domination was not a sudden crisis but a continuation of a long history. What the world would come to know as the Vietnam War was, to them, the latest chapter in an old and enduring fight. Part 2. A nation divided by war. The surrender of Japan in August 1945 created a vacuum across Asia. Empires that had dominated the region for decades collapsed almost overnight, and peoples long under foreign rule seized the chance to claim independence. Nowhere was this more dramatic than in Vietnam. After years of colonial exploitation and wartime famine, the moment seemed ripe for a new beginning. When Japanese forces withdrew, the Viet Minh moved quickly. They had spent years building networks in the countryside, earning loyalty by redistributing food, resisting occupiers, and promising change. Within days they occupied Hanoi, seized government offices, and declared the Democratic Republic of Vietnam. H. Chi Minh stood before a crowd of thousands and read a Declaration of Independence modeled partly on the American and French versions. His words spoke to centuries of struggle. Vietnam, he insisted, belonged to its people. They had endured enough suffering under foreign domination, and now they were determined to govern themselves. The declaration stirred enormous pride. Villagers across the countryside celebrated, while in cities people marched carrying the red flag with a gold star. To many, it seemed the dawn of a free nation. Yet international realities quickly clouded the dream. The Allies who had defeated Japan were not ready to allow revolutionary movements to reshape Asia unchecked. China, still reeling from its own war with Japan, sent troops into northern Vietnam to disarm Japanese soldiers. In the south, British forces landed in Saigon with the same mission. But their presence did not remain neutral for long. The British, seeking stability, allowed French colonial authorities to re-enter the south. Before 1945 was over, French troops had returned in force, determined to restore Indochina as a possession of their empire. The Viet Minh resisted, but they faced enormous challenges. Their control was strongest in the north and in rural areas, while French troops quickly re-established themselves in southern cities. Negotiations followed. H. Chi Minh hoped that some compromise might allow Vietnam recognition as an independent state within a French-led Commonwealth. But mistrust ran deep. France had little interest in surrendering control of valuable colonies. Within months, talks collapsed, and the fragile peace gave way to open conflict. The First Indochina War began in late 1946, and it would last nearly 8 years. It was a brutal struggle, fought in jungles, rice paddies, and remote highlands. For the French, it was an attempt to reassert colonial authority and prestige in the wake of their humiliation during World War II. For the Vietnamese, it was a fight for national survival. The conflict unfolded unevenly. French forces initially controlled major cities and roads, using superior firepower, artillery, and aircraft. They fortified strongpoints, confident that modern weapons would keep insurgents at bay. The Viet Minh, however, avoided direct confrontation. They relied on guerrilla tactics, ambushes, and their intimate knowledge of terrain. In villages, they blended in with civilians, making it difficult for French commanders to separate fighters from farmers. This asymmetrical war drained French resources and morale. The longer the war dragged on, the more the Viet Minh gained legitimacy. They portrayed themselves as the true defenders of Vietnam's independence, while the French appeared increasingly as outsiders clinging to a dying empire. Peasants who had endured famine and taxation under colonial rule saw in the Viet Minh a chance for change. Support grew despite the harshness of guerrilla warfare. International politics added another layer of complexity. The late 1940s marked the beginning of the Cold War. The United States and the Soviet Union sought to expand influence in Asia, each viewing local struggles as part of a global contest. At first, Washington hesitated to become involved. American officials recognized the contradiction of supporting French colonialism while proclaiming global support for freedom. Yet as communist movements gained strength across Asia, the mood shifted. The victory of Mao Zedong in China in 1949 alarmed Washington. Suddenly, Vietnam looked less like a colonial dispute and more like a potential front in the fight against communism. The Viet Minh benefited enormously from China's revolution. Once in power, the Chinese communists supplied weapons, training, and sanctuary across the northern border. For the first time, the Viet Minh had steady access to rifles, artillery, and supplies that could rival French forces. The balance of power began to tilt. The French attempted to counter with a strategy of fortified bases and large-scale sweeps, but the countryside remained difficult to control. French troops often found themselves isolated, relying on convoys vulnerable to ambush. The war grew costlier, both in money and in lives. Meanwhile, political support for the struggle weakened back in France, where many citizens questioned why their sons were dying in a faraway jungle. The decisive moment came in 1954 at the fortress of Immersive. Seeking to cut off Viet Minh supply lines into Laos, the French built a heavily fortified base in a remote valley. They believed it would draw the Viet Minh into a conventional battle that superior French firepower could win. Instead, General Vo Nguyen Giap, the brilliant strategist of the Viet Minh, turned the tables. Using tens of thousands of porters and workers, his forces dragged artillery through mountains and positioned them in the hills overlooking the French stronghold. In March, they unleashed a massive assault. For weeks the French garrison endured relentless bombardment and infantry attacks. Surrounded and outgunned, they finally surrendered in May 1954. The fall of Immersive shocked the world. It was the first time a colonial power had suffered such a decisive defeat at the hands of a nationalist, communist-led army. France, exhausted and humiliated, was forced to negotiate. At the Geneva Conference later that year, diplomats from major powers gathered to decide Vietnam's future. The outcome was a compromise that pleased no one fully. Vietnam would be temporarily divided along the 17th parallel. The North, under the Democratic Republic of Vietnam led by H. Chi Minh, would consolidate control. The South would remain under the State of Vietnam, headed by Emperor Bo Dai but supported by the French and increasingly by the Americans. National elections to reunify the country were promised for 1956. In reality, those elections never took place. US officials feared that H. Chi Minh, enjoying widespread popularity, would win by a landslide. Determined to prevent another perceived communist victory, Washington threw its weight behind the Southern regime. In 1955, Ngo Nh Diem, a nationalist politician with strong anti-communist credentials, pushed aside Bo Dai and declared himself president of the Republic of Vietnam. Thus, by the mid-1950s, Vietnam was no longer a single nation. It was divided, not only geographically but ideologically. The North pursued socialism, land reform, and alignment with the communist bloc. The South presented itself as the anti-communist alternative, dependent on American aid and advisors. Families found themselves split across the new border. Villages were divided by politics as much as by geography. This division set the stage for the conflict that would soon involve the United States directly. The war that Americans came to know in the 1960s was, in fact, a continuation of this earlier struggle. The French had tried and failed to hold Vietnam as a colony. Now the United States prepared to step in, convinced that the fate of Southeast Asia would shape the global balance of the Cold War. But for the Vietnamese people, the story was simpler and more tragic. They had fought first against the French, then against the Japanese, then again against the French. Now they would face another foreign power. The dream of independence, declared so boldly in 1945, remained unfulfilled. The nation was divided, the war unresolved, and the promise of peace still a distant hope. Part 3. The Cold War Domino. The defeat of France at Immersive in 1954 ended nearly a century of colonial rule in Vietnam. Yet instead of peace, the war produced a new division. The Geneva Conference that summer promised temporary separation and future elections, but in practice it created two competing states, each claiming to represent the true Vietnam. For the Vietnamese people, it was a painful partition. For the wider world, it became one more front line in the global confrontation between communism and the West. The Democratic Republic of Vietnam took firm control of the north under H. Chi Minh. His government quickly consolidated power, reorganized society, and carried out sweeping land reforms. These reforms sought to break the power of landlords and redistribute fields to peasants. Supporters hailed them as long-awaited justice, but the process was often harsh and violent. Accusations of collaboration with the French led to purges and executions. The regime also expanded education, launched literacy campaigns, and promoted industrial development, aligning itself closely with the Soviet Union and the newly established People's Republic of China. In the south, the Republic of Vietnam emerged under President Ngo Nh Dinh. Dinh was a Catholic in a predominantly Buddhist country, but he came from a prominent family and was fiercely anti-communist. With strong backing from the United States, he replaced the former Emperor Bo Dai and claimed legitimacy as the leader of an independent state. His government depended heavily on American economic and military aid. Roads, schools, and military installations were built with U.S. support. Washington hoped Dinh would transform the South into a bulwark of democracy in Southeast Asia. For American policymakers, the stakes seemed enormous. The Cold War was entering its most tense years. The Berlin blockade, the Korean War, and the Soviet nuclear program had convinced leaders in Washington that communism was advancing relentlessly. In Asia, the fall of China to Mao Zedong in 1949 had already sent shockwaves through American politics. Many in the United States argued that losing another nation in Asia to communism would be unacceptable. It was in this atmosphere that the so-called domino theory took hold. President Dwight D. Eisenhower articulated it plainly in 1954. If Vietnam fell to communism, he warned, then other nations in Southeast Asia, Laos, Cambodia, Thailand, even Indonesia, might follow, toppling one after another like a row of dominoes. The image was simple, dramatic, and persuasive. It shaped American policy for the next 2 decades. Yet beneath the rhetoric of freedom and democracy, the reality in South Vietnam was troubling. Dim's government was authoritarian, intolerant of dissent, and riddled with corruption. He centralized power in his family's hands, sidelining rivals and suppressing critics. The regime favored Catholics for positions in the army and bureaucracy, alienating the Buddhist majority. Land reform was promised but unevenly applied, leaving many peasants still struggling under heavy burdens. Opposition was met with arrests, censorship, and secret police. In the countryside, resentment simmered. Guerrilla groups who had once fought against the French began to regroup, this time against the Dinh government. Many of these fighters were communists loyal to the north, but others were simply nationalists disillusioned by Dim's rule. By the late 1950s, small-scale attacks and assassinations were spreading, signs of an insurgency that would soon engulf the entire South. Meanwhile, the United States deepened its involvement. At first, American support was framed as advisory, sending military trainers, economic aid, and equipment. But the line between advisor and participant blurred quickly. U.S. officials pressured Dinh to implement reforms, though with limited success. They also encouraged the building of a strong army capable of resisting northern infiltration. By the end of the decade, thousands of American advisors were already on the ground. In Hanoi, leaders watched these developments carefully. H. Chi Minh and General Vo Nguyen Giap weighed how best to advance reunification. Officially, they agreed at Geneva to the idea of elections, but when it became clear that the South and its American backers would not allow a nationwide vote, they shifted strategy. The North Vietnamese began supporting insurgents in the South, supplying weapons and training through covert routes that would later become the famous Ho Chi Minh Trail. The division hardened as the 1960s approached. On one side, The North promoted itself as the legitimate government of all Vietnam, rooted in revolutionary struggle and backed by communist allies. On the other, the South presented itself as a new, independent republic, supported by the most powerful nation on earth. The people of Vietnam, however, often saw something different. Two rival governments, each demanding loyalty, while ordinary families bore the weight of war. Events beyond Vietnam reinforced American fears. In 1959, Fidel Castro's revolution in Cuba created a communist state just 90 miles from the US coast. In 1961, the failed Bay of Pigs invasion and the looming Cuban Missile Crisis deepened Cold War anxieties. For US leaders, losing Vietnam was no longer only about Asia, it was about credibility worldwide. If America could not stop communism in a small country like Vietnam, how could allies trust its promises elsewhere? This logic pushed Washington into a deeper commitment, even as evidence mounted that Dim's government lacked popular support. By 1960, insurgents in the South had formally organized into the National Liberation Front, known to Americans as the Viet Cong. They coordinated attacks, assassinations, and propaganda campaigns, blending communist ideology with nationalist appeals. For many peasants, the Viet Cong's promises of land reform and justice seemed more credible than the corruption of Saigon. By the early 1960s, violence was escalating. Villages became battlegrounds between government forces and guerrillas. Advisors reported that South Vietnamese troops often lacked motivation, while the Viet Cong showed determination and discipline. American officials faced a choice: reduce involvement and risk losing the South, or expand support and risk being drawn into a deeper war. As John F. Kennedy entered the White House in 1961, the choice seemed clear to him. Kennedy increased the number of advisors, authorized new counterinsurgency programs, and backed Dim despite mounting criticism. Helicopters and modern equipment arrived, along with special forces units to train local troops. The war was still framed as a South Vietnamese struggle, but the American footprint was growing larger with every passing year. For the Vietnamese people, the divide of the 1950s created a reality of uncertainty and fear. Families separated by the 17th parallel struggled to communicate. Refugees fled from north to south and south to north, uprooted by ideology as much as by geography. In villages, loyalty was constantly tested. Support the government and risk retribution from guerrillas, or assist the insurgents and risk arrest by officials. Everyday life became politicized, and survival often meant navigating shifting allegiances. The domino theory, repeated endlessly in Washington, gave the impression that Vietnam's fate was preordained to trigger a cascade across Asia. Yet on the ground, the situation was more complex. Many Vietnamese were less concerned with global communism or democracy than with food, land, and dignity. The war that was coming would be framed as part of a Cold War struggle, but for those living in its shadow, it remained above all a fight about who truly represented the nation and who could deliver a better life. By the early 1960s, Vietnam was already on the path to deeper conflict. The North was determined to unify the country under its leadership. The South clung to survival with American aid. The United States, convinced that credibility was at stake, tied its future more tightly to Dim's government. The stage was set for escalation. What had begun as a colonial war against France had now become a Cold War battlefield. And soon, American troops would be fighting not only for the survival of South Vietnam but for the image of American power itself. Part 4. America steps in. By the early 1960s, Vietnam was a nation divided. The Geneva Accords had promised elections to unify the country, but those elections never took place. In the north, H. Chi Minh consolidated power with the backing of China and the Soviet Union. In the south, Ngo Dinh ruled as president of the Republic of Vietnam with American support. Both sides claimed to represent the true Vietnam. For Washington, the question was no longer whether to get involved but how deeply to commit. The Eisenhower administration had already laid the foundation. American advisors and aid flowed steadily into Saigon after 1954. The United States funded the South Vietnamese Army, helped train officers, and bankrolled infrastructure projects designed to strengthen Dim's rule. Eisenhower himself admitted in his memoirs that had elections been held as scheduled, H. Chi-min would likely have won a sweeping victory. This reality convinced American leaders that preventing elections was necessary to stop communism. Ngo Dinh was at first celebrated in Washington as a strong anti-communist leader. Time magazine praised him as the miracle man of Asia. His defiance of both French influence and communist insurgents appealed to Americans who wanted an independent, pro-Western Vietnam. Dinh launched ambitious programs to resettle refugees, stabilize the currency, and expand education. For a time, his regime seemed capable of building a viable alternative to the North. But the cracks appeared quickly. Dinh governed with a narrow base of support, favoring his Catholic allies in a largely Buddhist nation. His family occupied key posts, creating an atmosphere of nepotism and resentment. Political opposition was suppressed through arrests, censorship, and the feared secret police. Promised land reforms faltered, leaving peasants frustrated. Many in rural villages felt little loyalty to a government that seemed distant, corrupt, and unresponsive. As dissatisfaction grew, communist organizers in the South seized the opportunity. The National Liberation Front, known as the Viet Cong, expanded its activities after 1960. Guerrilla fighters launched ambushes, assassinated village officials, and spread propaganda portraying the Saigon regime as a puppet of America. By 1961, violence had spread across much of the countryside. John F. Kennedy entered the White House convinced that the Cold War would be won or lost in the developing world. The Bay of Pigs fiasco in Cuba and the construction of the Berlin Wall reinforced his belief that the United States had to show resolve. Vietnam, in Kennedy's eyes, was a test case. If America allowed South Vietnam to collapse, other nations in Asia might fall. Kennedy increased the number of U.S. military advisors dramatically. In 1960, fewer than 1,000 Americans were stationed in Vietnam. By the end of 1963, the number had risen to more than 16,000. Helicopters arrived to transport troops quickly across difficult terrain. Special Forces units trained South Vietnamese soldiers in counterinsurgency tactics. American pilots flew missions in support of Saigon's army, often blurring the line between advisor and combatant. Programs such as strategic hamlets were launched to cut villages off from Viet Cong influence. Families were relocated into fortified settlements surrounded by barbed wire, with the promise of protection and development. In practice, many peasants resented being uprooted, and corruption siphoned off much of the aid. Instead of winning hearts and minds, the program often alienated the very people it sought to protect. Despite the growing American presence, Dim's government faltered. Reports from the countryside told of soldiers unwilling to fight, officials taking bribes, and villagers sympathizing with the insurgents. U.S. advisors pushed Dinh to reform, but he resisted outside interference. His rigid style and reliance on family advisors deepened tensions. By 1963, unrest in South Vietnam reached a crisis. Buddhist monks, protesting Dim's favoritism toward Catholics, staged dramatic demonstrations. Images of monks setting themselves on fire in Saigon shocked the world and eroded Dim's legitimacy. In Washington, patience was running thin. American officials began to question whether Diem was an asset or a liability. In November 1963, a group of South Vietnamese generals staged a coup with at least tacit approval from American officials. Diem and his powerful brother Nhu were assassinated. The United States had helped remove the very man it once called indispensable. But instead of stabilizing the country, the coup ushered in a period of chaos. South Vietnam descended into political instability, with successive military juntas struggling for control. Just 3 weeks after Diem's death, John F. Kennedy was assassinated in Dallas. The burden of Vietnam now passed to Lyndon B. Johnson. Johnson inherited not just advisors and aid, but a commitment deeply embedded in America's Cold War thinking. To withdraw would look like weakness. To escalate carried risks few yet understood. By the end of 1963, more American personnel were in Vietnam than ever before, and the Viet Cong insurgency was growing stronger. The United States had stepped in gradually, confident that its wealth and technology could secure victory. Instead, it found itself entangled in a conflict shaped by local grievances, historical struggles, and a determined enemy. America had taken its first major steps into Vietnam's war. The path ahead would only grow darker. Part 5. Escalation. By late 1963, Vietnam was sliding deeper into turmoil. The assassination of Nguyen Diem removed a leader who had alienated much of his people, but it left the South Vietnamese government unstable and directionless. A succession of military juntas rose and fell in Saigon, each promising to restore order, none able to deliver lasting authority. In the countryside, the Viet Cong insurgency grew stronger. Villagers heard more from guerrilla organizers than from government officials, and loyalty to Saigon seemed increasingly fragile. For the United States, this instability came at a dangerous moment in the Cold War. Lyndon B. Johnson, newly sworn in after Kennedy's assassination, faced pressure to show resolve. Johnson had ambitions for sweeping social reforms at home, but he knew his presidency would be judged by foreign policy. To appear weak in the face of communism, especially after the Bay of Pigs and Berlin crises, was unthinkable. Vietnam, a small nation on the edge of Southeast Asia, suddenly loomed large as a test of American credibility. The turning point came in August 1964 in the waters of the Gulf of Tonkin. American naval vessels were patrolling off the coast of North Vietnam, monitoring communications and supporting South Vietnamese operations. On August 2nd, the destroyer USS Maddox reported being attacked by North Vietnamese patrol boats. 2 days later, in poor weather and amid confused signals, the Maddox and another ship, the USS Turner Joy, reported a second attack. Later evidence cast doubt on whether the second clash ever happened, but at the time Washington treated it as fact. Johnson seized the incident as an opportunity to secure congressional backing for stronger action. He presented the attacks as unprovoked aggression against the United States. Within days, Congress passed the Gulf of Tonkin resolution almost unanimously. It gave the president authority to take all necessary measures to defend U.S. forces and prevent further aggression. Though not a formal declaration of war, it effectively handed Johnson a blank check to escalate America's role in Vietnam. At first, Johnson moved cautiously. He did not want Vietnam to overshadow his domestic agenda, the Great Society programs aimed at tackling poverty and racial injustice. But events on the ground pressed him forward. South Vietnam remained weak and divided. The Viet Cong launched increasingly bold attacks, and reports from U.S. advisors painted a bleak picture of morale and effectiveness among South Vietnamese troops. In February 1965, the Viet Cong attacked an American base at Pleiku, killing 8 U.S. soldiers and wounding dozens. Johnson responded with Operation Rolling Thunder, a sustained bombing campaign against North Vietnam. The strikes were intended to punish Hanoi for supporting the insurgency and to demonstrate American resolve. Yet instead of deterring the enemy, the bombings hardened Northern determination. Soon Johnson authorized the deployment of ground combat units. In March 1965, U.S. Marines landed at Da Nang, officially tasked with defending air bases but quickly drawn into wider operations. By the end of the year, more than 180,000 American troops were in Vietnam. The advisory mission of the 1950s had transformed into a full-scale military commitment. The pace of escalation stunned many observers. In 1966, troop levels climbed to nearly 400,000, and by 1968 they peaked at over 500,000. Johnson, fearing accusations of weakness, increased commitment step by step, each justified as necessary to achieve victory. Yet victory proved elusive. The American strategy relied on superior firepower and mobility. Helicopters carried troops into remote areas for search-and-destroy missions. Artillery and airstrikes pounded suspected Viet Cong positions. The U.S. military measured progress by body counts, assuming that killing large numbers of enemy fighters would eventually break their will. But the Viet Cong and North Vietnamese forces proved remarkably resilient. They accepted high casualties, replaced losses quickly, and used the dense terrain to their advantage. Meanwhile, the human cost mounted. Villages caught between guerrillas and American operations suffered terrible losses. Bombing campaigns destroyed farmland and homes. The use of chemical defoliants like Agent Orange devastated landscapes and exposed civilians and soldiers alike to long-term health risks. Each new offensive intended to pacify the countryside often left more resentment and more recruits for the insurgency. Back home, Johnson tried to maintain public support. He insisted that the United States was making progress, that victory was just around the corner. But as casualties rose and images of burning villages appeared on nightly news broadcasts, doubts began to spread. For many Americans, Vietnam was becoming a war without clear purpose, a conflict far from home where their sons were dying with no end in sight. Still, in the mid-1960s, Johnson pressed on. Advisors like General William Westmoreland assured him that more troops and more time would bring success. Westmoreland argued that the enemy was nearing the breaking point. Johnson accepted these assessments, unwilling to be the president who lost Vietnam. Each year, more troops shipped out, more bombs fell, and more lives were lost. The escalation of 1965 to 1967 transformed the war and America itself. Vietnam was no longer a limited conflict managed by advisors. It was a massive military commitment drawing in hundreds of thousands of young Americans. Families across the United States felt the war's reach as the draft pulled students, workers, and fathers into uniform. Anti-war voices were still relatively small in these years, but they were growing. The stage was being set for deeper divisions, both in Vietnam and at home. By the time Johnson reached the midpoint of his presidency, the United States was deeply entangled. Withdrawal seemed impossible without humiliation, yet victory remained elusive despite overwhelming firepower. The war had escalated beyond recognition, and with it came consequences that neither Johnson nor his generals could yet fully see. Part 6. Jungle War. By 1966, the United States was fully committed to war in Vietnam. Hundreds of thousands of American soldiers were now stationed across the country, supported by fleets of helicopters, bombers, and artillery. General William Westmoreland's strategy of attrition was in full swing. Search-and-destroy missions, body counts, and relentless air campaigns aimed at wearing down the enemy. Yet on the ground, the war did not resemble the conventional battles American soldiers had been trained to fight. It was a war of ambushes, shadows, and survival, a war shaped as much by the jungle itself as by the enemy hiding within it. For many Americans arriving in Vietnam, the first shock was the environment. The climate was oppressive. Heat and humidity pressed down relentlessly, leaving uniforms soaked and equipment heavy. Monsoon rains turned dirt tracks into rivers of mud, bogging down vehicles and supply convoys. Soldiers lived in boots that never seemed to dry, plagued by blisters, fungal infections, and leeches. At night, mosquitoes carried the constant threat of malaria. The jungle was alive with sound, the calls of birds and insects, the rustle of unseen movement. Every sound could be natural, or it could signal danger. The Viet Cong and North Vietnamese army had adapted perfectly to this environment. They knew the terrain intimately, and they used it to frustrate American technology. Camouflage was everywhere. Soldiers melted into the foliage, weapons concealed in bamboo groves, tunnels hidden beneath villages. Guerrillas laid traps that could maim or kill without a shot fired. Punji stakes, sharpened bamboo coated with poison or excrement, were concealed in pits, waiting for a careless step. Tripwires triggered grenades or mines. To American soldiers, the jungle itself seemed hostile, every path a potential death trap. Search and destroy missions became the hallmark of American operations. Units were flown by helicopter into suspected Viet Cong areas, ordered to sweep through villages and forests, kill enemy fighters, and withdraw. Success was measured by body counts, the number of enemy dead reported after each mission. Yet this measure often distorted reality. Civilians killed in crossfire or bombing raids were sometimes counted as enemy combatants. Units under pressure to show progress exaggerated numbers. For soldiers in the field, the emphasis on body counts reduced the war to a grim arithmetic, detached from the actual goals of winning control of territory or people. Helicopters played a central role in this style of warfare. They carried troops into remote areas, evacuated the wounded, and delivered supplies. The distinctive thump of rotor blades became the soundtrack of the war. For soldiers, helicopters offered a lifeline, a way out of ambushes or a quick escape from enemy fire. Yet reliance on helicopters also underscored the difficulty of holding ground. Villages were swept one day, abandoned the next, often retaken by the Viet Cong as soon as American forces withdrew. The enemy rarely stood and fought pitched battles. Instead, they struck suddenly, then vanished. A convoy would be ambushed on a jungle road. A patrol would stumble into crossfire from hidden bunkers. Mortar rounds would rain down on an isolated outpost at night. Frustrated, American units often responded with overwhelming firepower. Artillery pounded suspected positions. Airstrikes incinerated patches of jungle. Villages suspected of harboring guerrillas were destroyed. Civilians caught in the middle suffered terribly, their homes burned and crops ruined. Each act of destruction, intended to break the enemy's hold, often drove more villagers to sympathize with the insurgents. The Viet Cong's network of tunnels became legendary. Beneath the earth stretched miles of passageways, complete with storage rooms, workshops, and hidden entrances. Fighters could launch attacks, disappear underground, and emerge miles away. Tunnels allowed them to survive bombing campaigns that devastated the surface. For American troops tasked with clearing them, the experience was terrifying. Tunnel rats, small soldiers armed with pistols and flashlights, crawled into the dark to search for traps, enemies, or supplies. Many never returned. Life in base camps was little easier. Soldiers endured boredom broken by sudden terror. Days of routine maintenance, guard duty, and oppressive heat could be shattered by a rocket attack or an ambush during a patrol. Letters from home provided comfort, but the war felt increasingly alien. Soldiers struggled to understand who the enemy was. Villagers by day might be guerrillas by night. A farmer carrying tools could be planting rice or laying a mine. The constant uncertainty eroded morale. Chemical warfare added another layer of horror. To deny the enemy cover, the US military sprayed millions of gallons of defoliants like Agent Orange across forests and fields. The chemicals stripped trees bare, turning jungles into skeletal landscapes. They also poisoned soil and water, leaving long-term health effects for both Vietnamese civilians and American veterans. At the time, commanders justified the spraying as necessary to expose enemy positions. For those living under the falling mist, it was another invisible weapon of war. For the Viet Cong and North Vietnamese soldiers, life was equally brutal. They lived on meager rations, carrying rice and salt in waterproof pouches. They marched for days along the Ho Chi Minh Trail, a vast network of paths and roads that wound through Laos and Cambodia, bringing supplies south despite constant American bombing. Fighters slept in hammocks in the jungle, endured disease, and faced relentless airstrikes. Yet their commitment remained strong. Many saw themselves as defending their homeland from foreign invaders, continuing the struggle their parents had waged against the French. The psychological toll on American troops grew heavier as the war dragged on. Fear, exhaustion, and the constant threat of ambush wore men down. Some units turned to alcohol or drugs to cope. Others lashed out at civilians, unable to distinguish friend from foe. Atrocities such as the My Lai massacre in 1968 were extreme examples of this breakdown, but they reflected the pressures of a war where moral clarity was hard to maintain. By 1967, Westmoreland insisted that progress was being made. He told the American public that the enemy was being worn down, that victory was near. But the reality on the ground told another story. Despite massive firepower, the Viet Cong remained active across the countryside. Villages continued to fall under their influence. North Vietnamese regulars joined the fight in larger numbers, bringing heavier weapons and greater coordination. The war was not being won, but few in Washington were ready to admit it. For soldiers in the jungle, the war felt endless. Patrols through dense foliage, nights on edge listening for movement, friends killed by unseen enemies. These were the daily rhythms of Vietnam. It was a war measured not in battles won or territory held, but in the grinding toll on human lives. The United States had entered Vietnam confident in its technology and power. The jungle, and the determination of those who fought within it, made those advantages far less certain. By the end of 1967, 500,000 American troops were in Vietnam, locked in a struggle that seemed to have no clear end. The Jungle War had become a test not only of military might but of endurance, morale, and will. And as the new year approached, the enemy prepared a surprise that would shake American confidence to its core. Part 7. The Wider Battlefield. By 1967, the war in Vietnam had already claimed tens of thousands of lives. American forces filled the jungles and rice paddies of the South, while the Viet Cong and North Vietnamese army fought with unrelenting determination. Yet Vietnam was not the only stage. The war's front lines increasingly crossed borders, stretching into Laos and Cambodia, countries whose neutrality existed more on paper than in reality. What began as a war for Vietnam's future soon became a regional conflict, pulling neighboring nations into its orbit and spreading destruction far beyond the 17th parallel. At the center of this expansion was the Ho Chi Minh Trail. More than just a path, it was a vast and shifting network of roads, tracks, tunnels, and footpaths running from North Vietnam through Laos and Cambodia into the south. Concealed beneath jungle canopy, the trail carried weapons, ammunition, food, and soldiers. Entire divisions could move south through this lifeline, sustained by depots and workshops hidden under foliage. American commanders understood that without the trail, the Viet Cong insurgency would wither. Cutting it off became an obsession. Bombing campaigns intensified. U.S. aircraft dropped millions of tons of ordnance on Laos in an attempt to destroy the trail, making the small nation one of the most heavily bombed places on Earth. Villages were obliterated, farmland cratered, rivers choked with debris. Yet the trail proved resilient. When one route was destroyed, engineers and laborists quickly carved new ones. Bridges blown apart by bombs were rebuilt within days. Supplies were carried on bicycles, by porters, or hidden in convoys that moved under the cover of night. The jungle swallowed the evidence of American raids, and the flow south continued. Cambodia, too, became entangled. Officially neutral under Prince Norodom Sihanouk, Cambodia tolerated the presence of Viet Cong sanctuaries along its eastern border. Guerrillas slipped across the frontier to rest, train, and regroup. The United States, aware of these sanctuaries, launched secret bombing campaigns beginning in 1969 under President Richard Nixon, though raids had started earlier in limited form. Villages suspected of harboring fighters were targeted without public acknowledgement, and civilians bore the brunt of these strikes. For many Cambodians, the war arrived suddenly and violently, destroying homes and scattering families who had no stake in Vietnam's conflict. Laos became another battlefield. The Royal Lao government, backed by the United States, faced its own communist insurgency, the Pathet Lao, who worked closely with Hanoi. To contain them, the CIA organized a secret war, recruiting and arming Hmong tribesmen to fight guerrilla campaigns against both the Pathet Lao and North Vietnamese forces using Lao territory. Entire communities were drawn into a shadow conflict, suffering losses far from the public eye. For the Hmong, loyalty to the Americans came at a terrible price, one that would haunt them long after the war ended. The expansion into Laos and Cambodia revealed the limits of American strategy. Air power could devastate villages and disrupt supply lines temporarily, but it could not decisively sever the Ho Chi Minh Trail. Nor could it eliminate sanctuaries across porous borders. Each bomb dropped seemed to harden resolve rather than break it. Vietnamese fighters adapted constantly, repairing, rerouting, and pressing on with their mission to infiltrate the South. Meanwhile, the spread of the war deepened its political complications. Critics at home and abroad questioned why nations that were officially neutral were suffering so heavily under American bombing. Images of burned villages in Cambodia and refugee flows from Laos fueled anger and suspicion. In Southeast Asia, resentment grew as populations who once viewed the United States with some sympathy came to see it as another destructive foreign presence. For American soldiers, the widening battlefield added to the frustration. Patrols along the borders often found themselves chasing an enemy who slipped effortlessly into neighboring countries where they could not legally pursue. Guerrillas attacked, retreated across invisible lines, and returned later to strike again. The sense of fighting an endless, borderless war eroded morale. By 1968, the conflict had become truly regional. North Vietnam supplied its war effort through neighboring states. The United States bombed, armed, and fought in territories never formally declared part of the war. Millions of civilians in Laos and Cambodia endured consequences they had little power to shape. What had once been framed as a fight for South Vietnam's independence had become something far larger, a test of Cold War resolve fought across half of Southeast Asia. In Washington, officials continued to insist that progress was being made. General Westmoreland reported that the enemy was being worn down, that attrition would eventually force Hanoi to negotiate. But the resilience of the trail, the persistence of cross-border sanctuaries, and the growing strength of the insurgency told another story. Despite overwhelming firepower, the enemy's lifelines remained intact. The wider battlefield was not just a geographic reality. It symbolized the war's drift beyond control. Each escalation created new fronts, new enemies, and new tragedies. Laos and Cambodia, countries that had tried to remain neutral, were dragged into a war that would leave scars for generations. For the United States, the expansion highlighted the paradox at the heart of its strategy. The more it tried to contain communism through force, the more the war spread and consumed the region. By the end of 1967, 500,000 American troops were in Vietnam, while bombers struck relentlessly at neighboring states. Yet victory remained elusive. The Ho Chi Minh Trail still carried supplies south. Guerrillas still struck at will. Civilians still suffered in growing numbers. The war's front lines were now blurred, stretching far beyond the maps drawn at Geneva in 1954. And as 1968 approached, the enemy prepared to shatter the illusion of American progress with one of the most ambitious offensives of the entire conflict. Part 8. Tet and Turning Point. By the start of 1968, American leaders insisted that the war in Vietnam was heading toward victory. General William Westmoreland assured President Lyndon B. Johnson and the American public that the enemy was weakening under relentless bombing and attrition. Official statements spoke of light at the end of the tunnel. Yet beneath the optimism, the reality on the ground told a different story. The Viet Cong and North Vietnamese army were battered, but far from broken. In secret, they were preparing a bold offensive that would shock the world and shatter the illusion of progress. The offensive came during Tet, the Vietnamese Lunar New Year, the most important holiday of the calendar. Traditionally, Tet was a time of family gatherings, ancestor worship, and temporary ceasefires. Many American commanders believed the holiday would bring a lull in fighting. Instead, in the early hours of January 30, 1968, tens of thousands of communist troops launched coordinated attacks across South Vietnam. The scale stunned both Americans and South Vietnamese forces. More than 100 towns and cities were struck simultaneously. Provincial capitals, military bases, and even Saigon itself came under attack. Guerrillas stormed the U.S. Embassy compound in Saigon, penetrating the grounds before being killed. Though quickly repelled, the assault sent shockwaves through the American public. Images of fighting in the embassy courtyard contradicted official claims that the war was nearly won. In the city of Hue, the battle raged for nearly a month. North Vietnamese and Viet Cong forces seized large parts of the city, fighting street by street, house by house. American Marines and South Vietnamese troops eventually retook Hue, but only after devastating bombardments reduced much of the historic city to rubble. Thousands of civilians were killed, many executed by communist forces accused of collaborating with the government. The battle left deep scars, a symbol of both the ferocity of the war and its terrible toll on ordinary people. Militarily, the Tet Offensive was a disaster for the communists. They suffered enormous casualties, losing tens of thousands of fighters. The Viet Cong, in particular, was decimated as a fighting force, its ranks thinned by the failed assaults. Yet strategically, Tet was a stunning success. It demonstrated that the enemy could strike anywhere, even in supposedly secure areas. It proved that the war was far from over, despite years of American escalation. And most importantly, it shattered American confidence. In the United States, the impact of Tet was immediate and profound. For years, officials had assured the public that the enemy was on the verge of defeat. The sight of fierce battles in Saigon and who made those claims ring hollow. Television brought the war into American living rooms like never before. Footage of street fighting, civilian casualties, and body bags eroded trust in government statements. Journalists who had once echoed official optimism now spoke openly of stalemate. The credibility gap, the distance between what leaders said and what people believed, widened into a chasm. Public opinion shifted rapidly. Support for the war dropped as Americans questioned why their sons were dying in a conflict that seemed endless and unwinnable. Protests grew larger, drawing students, clergy, veterans, and ordinary citizens. The anti-war movement, once on the margins, entered the mainstream. Johnson, who had staked his presidency on victory in Vietnam, saw his political standing collapse. Inside the White House, Tet forced a reckoning. Military commanders still argued that the offensive had been a defeat for the enemy, but Johnson recognized the political reality. Continuing the war at its current pace threatened to tear the country apart. In March 1968, he made a dramatic announcement: he would not seek re-election. He also began tentative moves toward de-escalation, halting some bombing raids and opening the door to peace talks. For the soldiers fighting in Vietnam, Tet was both terrifying and disillusioning. Many had believed official claims that the enemy was faltering. The sudden onslaught revealed an opponent far more determined and capable than they had been told. The heavy casualties and destruction deepened a sense of futility. Victory, if it was possible at all, seemed farther away than ever. For the Viet Cong and North Vietnamese, Tet carried mixed results. The losses were staggering, yet the political impact exceeded expectations. The offensive convinced American leaders that total military victory was out of reach. It strengthened Hanoi's belief that time was on their side, that persistence would wear down American will. Even as their fighters lay dead in the thousands, the Communists celebrated Tet as proof that they could strike at the heart of American power. The Tet Offensive marked the turning point of the Vietnam War. After Tet, American strategy shifted from escalation towards seeking an honorable exit. Though years of fighting still lay ahead, the illusion of imminent victory was gone. The war was no longer about winning decisively, but about finding a way out without appearing defeated. In Vietnam itself, the devastation was immense. Cities lay in ruins, villages were scarred, and civilians bore the brunt of the violence. Families mourned lost relatives, whether killed by bombs, executions, or crossfire. The dream of peace felt distant as the conflict deepened its grip on every aspect of life. Tet revealed the paradox of the war. The United States could win battles, inflict casualties, and destroy enemy strongholds. But it could not secure legitimacy for the South Vietnamese government, nor could it extinguish the determination of those who fought for unification. Military strength could not substitute for political credibility, and without credibility, no victory could last. By the end of 1968, the war had entered a new phase. American leaders spoke less of victory and more of Vietnamization, the hope that South Vietnam could eventually bear the burden of its own defense. Peace talks began in Paris, though they dragged on without resolution. At home, the war became the central issue of American politics, shaping elections, protests, and national identity. The Tet Offensive did not end the war, but it changed it irrevocably. It exposed the limits of American power, altered the course of a presidency, and transformed public opinion. From that moment on, the war in Vietnam was no longer simply fought on distant battlefields. It was fought in American living rooms, on college campuses, and in the halls of government. And in that larger battle, the battle for belief and legitimacy, the United States had already begun to lose. Part 9. War at Home. As 1968 unfolded, the Vietnam War was no longer just a conflict fought in Southeast Asia. It was also a conflict tearing at the fabric of American society. The Tet Offensive had shaken public confidence, and the sight of fighting in Saigon and who contradicted years of official reassurances. For many Americans, the war had ceased to be a distant engagement and had become a daily reality. It entered homes through the television screen, divided communities, and forced a reckoning over what kind of nation the United States wanted to be. The draft was one of the most immediate and personal ways the war reached into American lives. Unlike earlier conflicts, where mass mobilization had carried broad public support, the Vietnam draft was deeply unpopular. Young men were called by lottery to serve in a war that few understood and fewer still believed was winnable. College students could secure deferments, meaning that poorer and working-class men, disproportionately African American and from immigrant families, were more likely to be sent into combat. This imbalance bred resentment. Families who had little power in politics found their sons bearing the heaviest burdens. Protests grew steadily from the early 1960s, but after Tet they swelled into a nationwide movement. College campuses became epicenters of dissent. Students organized teach-ins, marches, and sit-ins, demanding an end to the war. Demonstrations spilled into city streets, sometimes met with police batons and tear gas. Chants of "Hell no, we won't go" echoed outside draft boards. Draft cards were burned in public as acts of defiance, symbolic rejections of the government's authority. For a generation coming of age, the war was not only a geopolitical issue but also a test of personal conscience. Music amplified the discontent. Folk singers like Bob Dylan and Joan Baez gave voice to protest, while rock bands such as Creedence Clearwater Revival and Country Joe and the Fish delivered scathing critiques of the war. Lyrics about soldiers dying in the jungle or the futility of killing resonated with millions. Concerts became rallies, and songs turned into anthems of resistance. For young Americans, music was both a soundtrack and a weapon, a way of expressing rage and sorrow in a world they felt slipping out of control. Television news transformed the war at home. For the first time in history, combat footage appeared nightly on national broadcasts. Viewers saw burning villages, wounded soldiers, and body bags returning on aircraft. Journalists such as Walter Cronkite, long trusted by the public, began to question official narratives. After visiting Vietnam during Tet, Cronkite concluded on air that the war was unwinnable. His sober assessment carried immense weight. President Johnson reportedly remarked, "If I've lost Cronkite, I've lost Middle America." The anti-war movement was diverse, drawing in students, clergy, civil rights activists, veterans, and ordinary citizens. Martin Luther King Jr., in his final year of life, denounced the war as a moral catastrophe, arguing that it drained resources from the fight against poverty and injustice at home. Clergy organized vigils and marches, framing opposition to the war in ethical and religious terms. Veterans returning from combat began to speak out, their voices carrying special authority. Groups like Vietnam Veterans Against the War challenged the image of soldiers as silent participants, exposing the realities of combat and atrocities committed in the field. But the movement also provoked backlash. Many Americans still believed in the necessity of the war, viewing protests as unpatriotic or even traitorous. Blue-collar workers, whose families supplied many of the draftees, often felt conflicted, angry at elites who escaped service but resentful of protesters who seemed to disrespect the sacrifices of soldiers. Demonstrations sometimes turned violent, as at the 1968 Democratic National Convention in Chicago, where clashes between protesters and police unfolded live on television. Images of blooded students and helmeted officers deepened the sense of a nation in turmoil. Inside the White House, Lyndon Johnson faced a crisis of legitimacy. He had escalated the war step by step, each time believing the next commitment would secure victory. Instead, the war consumed his presidency. In March 1968, he stunned the nation by announcing that he would not seek re-election. His decision reflected not only the toll of the war but also the growing awareness that Vietnam had fractured the American political consensus. Richard Nixon won the presidency later that year, promising peace with honor. His campaign appealed to what he called the silent majority, Americans who opposed the chaos of protests and longed for stability. Yet even as Nixon promised to end the war, he expanded it into Cambodia and Laos, fueling further unrest at home. The protests did not fade, they grew. The war at home was not only political but cultural. Families were divided across dinner tables. Generations clashed, as parents who had supported World War II struggled to understand their children's rejection of Vietnam. Communities fractured between hawks and doves, patriots and protesters. The conflict seeped into art, literature, and film, leaving a cultural imprint that would last long after the shooting stopped. For soldiers, the return home was often fraught. Unlike veterans of earlier wars, many Vietnam veterans were met not with parades but with indifference or hostility. Some faced accusations from protesters, while others felt abandoned by the government that had sent them to fight. The trauma of combat combined with the alienation of homecoming created lasting scars. Post-traumatic stress, not yet widely recognized, haunted thousands. Addiction and homelessness followed many who could not reintegrate into civilian life. By the early 1970s, the war had become the central issue of American life. It overshadowed domestic policy, reshaped elections, and defined a generation. The United States was not only fighting in the jungles of Vietnam but also in the streets of its own cities, in classrooms, in living rooms, and in the hearts of its people. The war at home revealed a truth as devastating as any battlefield defeat. America was divided against itself. The government struggled to maintain credibility. Citizens questioned the very purpose of the war. The young resisted in numbers unseen in previous conflicts. And the soldiers who fought carried the burden of both combat abroad and controversy at home. By 1969, the scale of opposition forced Nixon to shift tactics, promising gradual withdrawal and the policy of Vietnamization. Yet even as troop levels began to decline, the war's imprint on American society remained indelible. It had transformed politics, culture, and identity. For millions, Vietnam was no longer just a place on a map. It was a wound carried in memory, a conflict that revealed the limits of power abroad and unity at home. Part 10. Cracks in the System. By 1969, the Vietnam War was no longer just a foreign policy challenge. It had become a crisis of trust. For years, American leaders had promised progress, assuring the public that victory was near. But the Tet Offensive had exposed those claims as hollow, and with every passing month, the gap between official statements and battlefield realities grew wider. This credibility gap, as journalists called it, eroded faith not only in the war effort but in the institutions of government itself. The most devastating blow to public confidence came in the form of atrocities. On March 16, 1968, a company of American soldiers entered the village of My Lai in Quang Ngai province. Believing the area to be a Viet Cong stronghold, they expected resistance. Instead, they found unarmed civilians, women, children, and the elderly. Over the course of several hours, the soldiers massacred more than 500 villagers. Homes were burned, crops destroyed, and the ground littered with bodies. Only a handful of villagers survived by hiding under corpses or fleeing into the fields. The incident was initially covered up by military officials. Reports described a successful engagement with enemy forces, claiming high body counts. But whispers of the truth began to circulate, and by late 1969 investigative journalists exposed the atrocity. Photographs of the massacre shocked the world. Piles of dead children, women pleading for their lives, American soldiers standing among the ruins. My Lai became a symbol of everything that had gone wrong in Vietnam. It was not only a moral catastrophe but also evidence that the strategy of attrition had warped the conduct of war itself. For many Americans, My Lai confirmed their worst fears. The war was not simply misguided, it was corrupting the very values it claimed to defend. The idea of American soldiers as liberators collapsed under the weight of images that showed them as executioners. The massacre deepened divisions at home. Anti-war activists seized on it as proof that the war was criminal, while supporters struggled to defend a cause that seemed increasingly indefensible. Other revelations compounded the crisis. The Pentagon Papers, leaked in 1971, revealed that successive administrations had misled the public about the scale and prospects of the war. Secret bombing campaigns in Cambodia and Laos, conducted without congressional approval or public knowledge, came to light. Each disclosure widened the credibility gap. Americans no longer trusted the reassurances of generals or presidents. The government's words carried less weight than the images on television or the testimony of returning veterans. Within the military, cracks appeared as well. Morale among soldiers deteriorated. Units faced not only the enemy but also disillusionment within their own ranks. Fragging, the deliberate killing of unpopular officers with grenades, became disturbingly common. Drug use spread through the ranks, as heroin and marijuana offered temporary escape from the fear and monotony of jungle patrols. Soldiers counted the days until their tours ended, focused more on survival than on victory. At home, political divisions hardened. Hawks demanded renewed escalation, insisting that the United States must not appear weak. Doves pressed for immediate withdrawal, arguing that no amount of bloodshed could alter the outcome. The conflict seeped into every aspect of American life: dinner table arguments, college debates, campaign rallies. The war was no longer a distant policy dispute but the defining issue of a generation. Richard Nixon, who entered the White House in 1969, promised peace with honor. He sought to reduce American casualties through Vietnamization, shifting the burden of combat to South Vietnamese forces while gradually withdrawing U.S. troops. Yet at the same time, he expanded the air war and authorized incursions into Cambodia. For protesters, these moves betrayed his promises. For supporters, they reflected the necessity of fighting communism with strength. The result was a nation trapped between impatience for peace and fear of humiliation. Television continued to erode support. Nightly news broadcasts showed burning villages, crying children, and weary soldiers trudging through the mud. The war seemed endless, its goals increasingly unclear. Journalists challenged official statements, exposing contradictions and failures. Trust in institutions, the presidency, the Pentagon, even the media itself, eroded. The credibility gap was more than a political problem. It was a cultural fracture. For many Americans, Vietnam symbolized a broader sense of betrayal. Government had lied. Leaders had failed. The cost was paid in lives, both American and Vietnamese, with no clear purpose achieved. The war, once defended as a fight for freedom, was now seen by millions as a symbol of futility. In Vietnam, the cracks were equally stark. South Vietnamese governments rose and fell, plagued by corruption and inefficiency. Despite billions in American aid, the army often faltered in the field, and loyalty among villagers remained fragile. In the north, leaders pressed on with determination, confident that time and American divisions would bring them victory. By the early 1970s, the war was no longer about winning in any conventional sense. It was about managing collapse, at home, in the field, and in the credibility of American leadership. My Lai, the Pentagon Papers, and the widening credibility gap ensured that even if soldiers could fight battles abroad, the war for trust at home was already lost. Part 11. Vietnamization. When Richard Nixon entered the White House in January 1969, he inherited a war that had drained American resources, shattered public confidence, and divided the nation. He had campaigned on a promise to achieve peace with honor, a phrase that suggested withdrawal without defeat, disengagement without humiliation. For a country exhausted by years of fighting and a mounting death toll, his pledge carried hope. Yet Nixon's approach was neither simple nor immediate. He sought to reduce the visible American role in Vietnam while still pursuing military pressure on Hanoi. The policy that emerged became known as Vietnamization. Vietnamization aimed to shift the burden of the war from American troops to the Army of the Republic of Vietnam, or ARVN. Under this strategy, U.S. combat forces would gradually withdraw, while South Vietnamese soldiers received expanded training, modern equipment, and greater responsibility for defending their country. The plan promised to reduce American casualties and calm opposition at home while maintaining the appearance of strength abroad. Nixon argued that the South Vietnamese needed to stand on their own if the Republic was to survive. At first, the idea seemed promising. American troop levels began to decline in 1969, falling from a peak of over 500,000. Families welcomed their sons home, and the number of U.S. dead dropped. Nixon spoke confidently of progress, presenting Vietnamization as a pathway to peace. But beneath the optimism lay deep problems. The ARVN was plagued by corruption, desertion, and uneven morale. While some units fought bravely, others collapsed under pressure. Many soldiers were loyal to local commanders or families rather than to the state. Despite billions of dollars in American aid, South Vietnam struggled to field a force capable of replacing U.S. power. Meanwhile, Nixon paired Vietnamization with expanded military action. He believed that reducing American ground troops would not be enough. Hanoi had to be pressured into negotiating. To that end, he authorized a massive expansion of the air war. Bombing campaigns intensified against North Vietnam and along the Ho Chi Minh Trail. Secret raids targeted Laos and Cambodia, nations officially neutral but used by Hanoi as sanctuaries and supply routes. In April 1970, Nixon announced that American and South Vietnamese forces had entered Cambodia to attack Viet Cong bases. The move was deeply controversial. Nixon presented it as necessary to protect withdrawing U.S. troops, but for critics it seemed a betrayal of his promise to de-escalate the war. Protests erupted across the United States, reaching a tragic climax at Kent State University in Ohio. On May 4th, National Guard troops opened fire on demonstrators, killing 4 students. The shootings shocked the nation and fueled further outrage against the war. The Cambodian incursion highlighted the contradictions of Nixon's policy. On one hand, he promised withdrawal and peace. On the other, he expanded the conflict into new territories, spreading destruction and drawing in more civilians. Cambodia descended into chaos, destabilized by bombings and invasion. The turmoil created fertile ground for the Khmer Rouge, a radical communist movement that would later unleash one of the century's worst genocides. Laos, too, bore the weight of escalation. The CIA's secret war expanded as Hong fighters, backed by American money and air power, clashed with the Pathet Lao and North Vietnamese units. Villages were destroyed, families displaced, and the countryside blanketed with bombs. Though hidden from most Americans, the suffering in Laos was immense. At home, the war's expansion further deepened the credibility gap. Nixon had promised peace, but the war seemed only to spread. Protesters filled streets, campuses, and city squares. Veterans joined marches, speaking of atrocities and disillusionment. The nation's divisions grew sharper, as supporters of the war clashed with those demanding an end. Even as protests raged, diplomacy inched forward. In Paris, representatives from the United States, South Vietnam, North Vietnam, and the National Liberation Front met for peace talks. The negotiations dragged on endlessly, bogged down by arguments over procedures, recognition, and withdrawal. Hanoi demanded a full U.S. exit and the removal of President Nguyen Vien Thieu in Saigon. Washington insisted on preserving the South Vietnamese government and securing the return of prisoners of war. Each side maneuvered, hoping battlefield realities would strengthen its hand at the table. Nixon relied heavily on his national security advisor, Henry Kissinger, to manage these talks. Kissinger pursued both public negotiations and secret channels, seeking to craft an agreement that would allow the United States to leave without admitting defeat. At the same time, Nixon escalated pressure on Hanoi through the most intense bombing campaigns of the war. The message was clear: the United States would not withdraw without terms that preserved some dignity. For American soldiers still in Vietnam, the contradictions of policy were felt daily. Troop levels were declining, but those who remained continued to patrol jungles, fight ambushes, and endure casualties. Some units found themselves training ARVN counterparts who lacked the discipline or resources to sustain operations. Soldiers counted down the days until their tours ended, uncertain whether their sacrifices made any difference. For South Vietnamese civilians, the situation remained precarious. Villages were caught between government forces, communist guerrillas, and American operations. The promise of Vietnamization meant little when survival was at stake. Bombings destroyed crops, displacement uprooted families, and fear of reprisals lingered. The war ground on, its front lines shifting but never disappearing. By 1971, American troop levels had fallen dramatically, but fighting remained fierce. In early 1971, ARVN forces launched Operation Lam Son 719, an ambitious attempt to cut the Ho Chi Minh Trail in Laos. Supported by U.S. air power, South Vietnamese troops advanced across the border but soon faced devastating counterattacks. Units broke under pressure, retreating in disarray. The operation ended in humiliation, exposing once again the fragility of Vietnamization. If South Vietnam could not carry out major operations even with massive American support, how could it survive alone? Despite these setbacks, Nixon pressed on. He needed to show progress for both political and strategic reasons. In 1972, as his re-election campaign loomed, Hanoi launched the Easter Offensive, a massive assault across South Vietnam. ARVN forces, backed by overwhelming American airstrikes, eventually repelled the offensive, but only at enormous cost. The fighting underscored the dependence of South Vietnam on U.S. air power. Without it, the Republic might have collapsed. To break Hanoi's will, Nixon unleashed Operation Linebacker and later Linebacker II, the so-called Christmas bombings of December 1972. For nearly 2 weeks, waves of B-52 bombers struck Hanoi and Haiphong, reducing neighborhoods to rubble and killing thousands. The raids horrified the world and sparked renewed protests in the United States, but they also pushed North Vietnam back to the negotiating table. In January 1973, the Paris Peace Accords were signed. The agreement called for a ceasefire, the withdrawal of American troops, the return of prisoners of war, and a commitment to respect South Vietnam's sovereignty. Nixon proclaimed the deal as peace with honor. In reality, it was more an exit strategy than a resolution. The United States had secured a way out, but the underlying conflict between North and South remained unresolved. For Americans, Vietnamization meant the end of the draft, the return of soldiers, and the hope of closure. For South Vietnam, It meant standing alone against a determined enemy, with fewer resources and no guarantee of lasting support. The policy had bought time for the United States but had not secured the survival of the Saigon regime. Vietnamization revealed the contradictions of the entire war effort. America sought to leave while maintaining credibility. It reduced ground forces while widening the air war. It promised peace while spreading conflict into neighboring countries. In the end, the policy allowed the United States to disengage, but it did not bring peace to Vietnam. For the people of Southeast Asia, the years of Vietnamization brought no relief. Laos and Cambodia endured devastation that reshaped their histories. South Vietnamese soldiers and civilians faced continued battles. North Vietnam prepared patiently for the final push. The war was far from over. What Vietnamization achieved was not victory, but a transition, a way for America to step back, leaving others to face the consequences. Part 12. The Final Years. The signing of the Paris Peace Accords in January 1973 marked a turning point in the Vietnam War, but not its end. For the United States, the agreement provided an exit. American troops began leaving Vietnam, prisoners of war were released, and the draft came to a close. President Richard Nixon declared that the United States had achieved peace with honor. Yet beneath the rhetoric, the conflict in Vietnam continued. The ceasefire quickly broke down, both sides resumed fighting, and the survival of South Vietnam remained uncertain. For the people of Vietnam, the years after the Accords were anything but peaceful. The North Vietnamese Army and the Viet Cong continued to press their campaign. South Vietnamese forces, though better equipped than ever, struggled to hold territory without direct American combat support. The ARVN still relied heavily on U.S. airstrikes, but with the departure of American pilots, that advantage diminished. Villages remained battlegrounds, with civilians once again caught between shifting front lines. Nixon tried to reassure Saigon that America would stand by its ally. He promised massive financial aid and pledged continued air support if the North violated the agreement. For a brief moment, these assurances sustained South Vietnamese hopes, but events in Washington soon undercut them. In 1973, the Watergate scandal exploded, consuming Nixon's presidency. As investigations revealed the extent of political corruption and abuse of power, the president's credibility collapsed. By August 1974, facing almost certain impeachment, Nixon resigned in disgrace. His successor, Gerald Ford, inherited not only a wounded presidency but also the crumbling commitment to South Vietnam. Congress, weary of war and distrustful after years of deception, refused to grant further large-scale funding for the conflict. Requests for emergency aid to Saigon were rejected. Public opinion had turned decisively against further involvement. The American people, after nearly 2 decades of entanglement, wanted no more sacrifices in Southeast Asia. For South Vietnam, the loss of American support proved catastrophic. Without U.S. air power, ARVN units found themselves exposed. Supply shortages worsened, morale faltered, and desertions increased. Corruption hollowed out the state, with officers pocketing funds while soldiers went unpaid. In the countryside, loyalty to Saigon remained fragile, easily undermined by communist propaganda and intimidation. North Vietnam, by contrast, was patient and determined. Its leaders had signed the Paris Agreement knowing they could outlast their enemy. With American combat forces gone and U.S. political will broken, Hanoi prepared for the final push. In December 1974, they launched the Tay Nguyen Offensive in the Central Highlands. ARVN forces collapsed more quickly than anyone expected. What began as a limited campaign soon snowballed into a nationwide offensive. By March 1975, South Vietnam was in free fall. Cities like Hue and A with Grave NNG were abandoned in chaotic retreats. Refugees clogged roads, fleeing ahead of advancing communist troops. The ARVN, demoralized and disorganized, crumbled in the face of the onslaught. President Nguyen Vien Thieu pleaded for American aid, but Washington could offer only words. The United States had neither the political will nor the public support to re-enter the war. In April, communist forces closed in on Saigon. Panic gripped the capital. American officials prepared emergency evacuations, moving diplomats, civilians, and South Vietnamese allies out by helicopter. The operation, codenamed Frequent Wind, became one of the most dramatic images of the entire war. Crowds of desperate South Vietnamese swarmed the U.S. Embassy, pleading for escape. Helicopters lifted evacuees from rooftops as North Vietnamese tanks rolled ever closer. On April 30, 1975, the end came. North Vietnamese troops entered Saigon virtually unopposed. Tanks crashed through the gates of the presidential palace, and the South Vietnamese government surrendered. The city was renamed Ho Chi Minh City, and after decades of struggle, Vietnam was reunified under communist rule. For the Vietnamese people, the war's end brought both relief and hardship. The fighting had finally stopped, but the country lay in ruins. Cities were shattered, farmland devastated, and millions displaced. Families divided by the 17th parallel were reunited, but at a terrible cost. The new regime imposed strict controls, re-educating former officials and sending many to labor camps. Hundreds of thousands fled the country by boat, risking perilous journeys to escape repression and poverty. For the United States, the fall of Saigon was a moment of humiliation. Images of helicopters evacuating Americans from rooftops symbolized defeat. The war had claimed the lives of more than 58,000 U.S. soldiers, wounded hundreds of thousands more, and consumed vast resources. It had divided the nation, toppled a presidency, and left deep scars on American society. Vietnam Syndrome, a reluctance to intervene militarily abroad, took hold in U.S. politics for years to come. The final years revealed the contradictions at the heart of the war. America had sought to defend freedom abroad but lost credibility at home. It had poured resources into building an ally, yet corruption and weak leadership undermined those efforts. It had relied on overwhelming firepower but failed to secure legitimacy in the hearts of the people it claimed to protect. In the end, South Vietnam fell not because its soldiers would not fight, but because it depended on a partner that no longer had the will to continue. For Hanoi, victory came at a staggering price. Millions of Vietnamese had died, the landscape was scarred by bombs and chemicals, and the economy was shattered. Yet the North's leaders had achieved what they long sought, the reunification of their country. For them, the sacrifices were justified by the end of foreign domination. For the United States, the lessons of the final years were sobering. Technology, firepower, and wealth could not guarantee victory in a war of national identity and determination. Domestic politics mattered as much as military campaigns. Without public trust, no war could be sustained indefinitely. The fall of Saigon was not just the end of a conflict abroad, but the culmination of a crisis of confidence at home. The war that had begun as a colonial struggle against France, drawn in Japan, expanded into Laos and Cambodia, and consumed America, had finally ended. Vietnam was whole again, though scarred. America was changed, though divided. The final years of the war revealed the limits of power and the high cost of hubris. They closed one of the most painful chapters in modern history, leaving questions that would echo long after the last helicopter lifted from the embassy roof. Part 13. The Human Cost. When the guns finally fell silent in 1975, the war in Vietnam had left behind devastation that could not be measured only in military terms. For all the maps drawn, offensives launched, and speeches made, the real weight of the war lay in its human cost. It was a cost borne most heavily by the people of Vietnam, in their villages, their families, and their bodies, but also by the American soldiers who fought, the families who waited at home, and the millions of refugees displaced across the region. The numbers alone tell a staggering story. Estimates of Vietnamese deaths vary, but most historians agree that between 2 and 3 million people lost their lives during the conflict. The majority were civilians, caught in bombings, massacres, and crossfire. Every family in Vietnam carried losses. Entire generations were shaped by absence, fathers gone, children buried, mothers lost in the chaos. The United States suffered more than 58,000 dead and over 150,000 wounded. Hundreds of thousands more carried invisible wounds, trauma that lingered long after they returned home. For Vietnamese civilians, the war was inescapable. Villages that had stood for centuries were burned to the ground. Families were uprooted and resettled in strategic hamlets, often against their will, stripped of ancestral land and placed behind barbed wire. Bombing campaigns destroyed crops and irrigation systems, bringing hunger to the countryside. The use of napalm left survivors with horrific burns, their skin scarred for life. Agent Orange, sprayed over forests and fields to strip away cover, poisoned soil and water. Children were born with deformities long after the war ended, a legacy of chemicals that lingered in the land and in bodies. The war also created millions of refugees. Some fled the fighting, moving from countryside to city in search of safety. Saigon and other urban centers swelled with displaced families living in makeshift shelters. Others fled after the war, especially those who had worked with the Americans or the South Vietnamese government. Hundreds of thousands took to the seas in rickety boats, the so-called boat people, risking storms, pirates, and starvation in desperate bids for freedom. Many perished at sea. Those who survived resettled in the United States, Canada, Australia, and Europe, building new lives while carrying memories of trauma and exile. For American soldiers, the war left lasting scars. Many were drafted, sent to fight in a country they barely knew, for a cause they struggled to understand. They patrolled jungles, faced ambushes, and lived with the constant threat of sudden death. When they returned home, they often found no welcome. Unlike the parades of World War II, Vietnam veterans were met with indifference, suspicion, or even hostility. Some were blamed for the war itself. Many struggled with what would later be recognized as post-traumatic stress disorder, nightmares, flashbacks, depression. Drug use, begun in Vietnam as a way to cope, followed many into civilian life. Rates of homelessness and suicide among veterans soared. Families at home carried their own burdens. Mothers received telegrams announcing their sons' deaths. Wives raised children alone. Parents watched their returning sons grow distant, haunted by what they had seen. Communities divided over whether to honor or condemn the men who had fought. The war stretched across oceans, leaving its mark on kitchens, churches, and neighborhoods in every corner of America. The human cost was also political. The war eroded trust in government, leaving citizens skeptical of official statements. It deepened racial and class divides, as poor and minority communities suffered disproportionately from the draft. It fractured generations, setting parents and children against each other over questions of duty, morality, and justice. The scars of Vietnam were not only physical but social, reshaping how Americans understood themselves and their nation's role in the world. For the Vietnamese, recovery was slow and painful. The countryside remained littered with unexploded ordnance, landmines, and bombs that continued to kill long after the fighting ended. Fields once fertile were poisoned. Infrastructure lay in ruins. Rebuilding required not only bricks and mortar but also healing from grief that seemed bottomless. For those who had lost loved ones, the war never truly ended. Memory itself became a battlefield, as families tried to make sense of sacrifice, survival, and loss. The war's human cost extended even into the future. Agent Orange left genetic damage that appeared in the children and grandchildren of those exposed. Veterans in both Vietnam and the United States struggled with cancers and other illnesses linked to chemicals used during the war. Refugee communities carried intergenerational trauma, passing down stories of flight and fear to their descendants. The echoes of the war continued to shape lives decades after the last shots were fired. Perhaps most profoundly, the Vietnam War revealed the limits of measuring conflict through numbers alone. Body counts, sorties flown, and bombs dropped had been the metrics of progress. But they concealed the true story, the suffering of ordinary people. For those who lived through it, the war was not about dominoes on a geopolitical map or speeches in distant capitals. It was about survival, about finding food in bombed-out fields, about searching for loved ones among the missing, about enduring the daily terror of living in a land torn apart. The human cost of Vietnam was the measure of its failure. America had sought to defend freedom abroad, yet it left behind shattered lives and broken trust. Vietnam had sought reunification and independence, but the price was years of devastation. Both nations emerged scarred, their people carrying burdens that statistics could never capture. When we speak of the Vietnam War today, we often recall its battles, its politics, its strategies. Yet the truest legacy lies in its human cost, in the grief of families, the scars of veterans, and the resilience of those who endured. It is a legacy written not only in history books but in memories, bodies, and lives that bear its mark even now. Part 14. A Nation in Reflection. When the last helicopter lifted off from Saigon in April 1975, the war was over for the Vietnamese in one sense. Their country was reunified under communist rule. For the United States, however, the war did not end so neatly. Its shadow lingered over politics, culture, and memory for decades. Vietnam was not simply a military defeat, it was a wound in the national psyche, a challenge to America's identity as a global power, and a question mark over its future role in the world. Politically, the war produced what came to be known as Vietnam Syndrome. This phrase described a reluctance to commit U.S. forces abroad, born of the trauma of Vietnam. Policymakers feared being trapped in another unwinnable war, where overwhelming firepower could not deliver victory and public support crumbled under the weight of casualties. Presidents from Gerald Ford to Jimmy Carter to Ronald Reagan grappled with the legacy. Reagan tried to reframe Vietnam not as a defeat of American soldiers, but as a failure of political will. He argued that the military had fought bravely, only to be undermined by leaders who lacked resolve. Yet the caution remained. Every new intervention was measured against the fear of another Vietnam. Culturally, the war became a touchstone for artists, filmmakers, and musicians trying to make sense of its meaning. In literature, works like Tim O'Brien's The Things They Carried blurred the line between fact and memory, capturing the surreal horror and moral ambiguity faced by soldiers. In cinema, films like Apocalypse Now, Platoon, and Full Metal Jacket offered searing visions of combat, madness, and disillusionment. Each portrayed Vietnam not as a story of victory or defeat, but as a descent into confusion and moral chaos. For audiences, these depictions reinforced the sense that Vietnam was different from other wars. Darker, more ambiguous, harder to explain. Music, too, carried the war's imprint. Songs written during the conflict, anthems of protest or defiance, became part of the soundtrack of American memory. Dylan, Hendrix, Creedence, and countless others captured both the anger of a generation and the sorrow of loss. Later musicians returned to the subject, reflecting on what it had meant to grow up in an age where war was constant, televised, and contested at home. The cultural reckoning extended into memorials. In 1982, the Vietnam Veterans Memorial opened in Washington, D.C. Its design was controversial, a long black wall engraved with the names of more than 58,000 Americans who had died. Unlike traditional monuments of generals and triumph, this memorial offered no sense of victory, only reflection. Visitors ran their hands over the names, left flowers, letters, or medals at its base. The wall became a place of mourning, healing, and confrontation with the scale of loss. For veterans who had felt forgotten or vilified, the memorial provided recognition. For families, it offered a sacred space to grieve. For the nation, it symbolized a shift, from debate about the war's purpose to acknowledgement of its cost. Vietnam also reshaped journalism. The conflict had been the first television war, broadcast nightly into American homes. Reporters on the ground challenged official narratives, exposing contradictions and atrocities. Afterward, both government and military leaders wrestled with how much media coverage had influenced public opinion. Some argued that the press had undermined the war effort. Others countered that it was government deception, not journalism, that destroyed credibility. In later conflicts, from Grenada to the Gulf War, efforts were made to control information more tightly, reflecting lessons or misinterpretations drawn from Vietnam. For veterans, reflection was often painful. Many struggled with post-traumatic stress, long before it was widely understood or treated. Nightmares, flashbacks, and isolation haunted them. Some turned to veteran organizations, finding solidarity with others who had shared the experience. Others withdrew, scarred by a sense of betrayal, sent to fight in a war their country no longer wanted to acknowledge. The stories they carried often remained unspoken for years, only emerging gradually in memoirs, interviews, or therapy. Their silence itself became part of the war's legacy. For refugees who fled Vietnam, reflection meant building new lives far from home. Communities of Vietnamese immigrants grew in California, Texas, and elsewhere, reshaping American culture even as they mourned the loss of their homeland. Their stories complicated the narrative of Vietnam, reminding Americans that the war had not ended with the departure of U.S. troops but had continued in the lives of those forced into exile. The war also forced Americans to reconsider questions of race, class, and equality. African American soldiers had been drafted in disproportionate numbers, leading many in the civil rights movement to condemn the war as unjust at home as well as abroad. Martin Luther King Jr.'s 1967 speech denouncing the war highlighted this connection, arguing that the United States could not fight for freedom abroad while denying it at home. These critiques resonated deeply in later decades, shaping how the war was remembered not only as a foreign policy failure but also as a mirror of domestic inequality. In politics, the shadow of Vietnam influenced decisions for decades. Every intervention, in Central America, the Middle East, or beyond, was debated in terms of another Vietnam. Leaders promised quick, decisive actions, wary of being accused of quagmire. Even when the United States entered new conflicts, from Desert Storm in 1991 to Iraq and Afghanistan in the 2000s, the comparisons were unavoidable. Vietnam remained the benchmark for failure, the example every administration sought to avoid. Reflection also took a more personal form. For many Americans who lived through the era, Vietnam was woven into memory alongside assassinations, civil rights struggles, and cultural upheaval. It was not only a war but also a symbol of a nation questioning itself. College protests, draft lotteries, and the images of helicopters over Saigon became milestones in personal histories. The war was not just an event on the news but a defining moment of youth, family, and identity. By the late 20th century, Vietnam had become both a scar and a lesson. For some, the lesson was caution. Do not commit to wars without clear goals, public support, and an understanding of local realities. For others, the lesson was about willpower, that America must never again withdraw under pressure, lest it embolden enemies. These competing interpretations ensured that Vietnam remained contested in memory, its meaning never fully settled. Yet in reflection, one truth stands clear. The Vietnam War changed how Americans saw themselves and their place in the world. It stripped away assumptions of invincibility, revealed the limits of power, and forced a reckoning with the consequences of intervention. It left behind a legacy measured not in victories but in questions. Questions that echo still, every time the United States debates whether to send soldiers abroad. Part 15. The Legacy. When the last American helicopters lifted from Saigon in April 1975, the war appeared to end in a single moment of chaos and surrender. Yet its legacy has stretched far beyond that day, shaping lives, politics, and memory for decades. Vietnam was not simply a conflict contained within Southeast Asia. It was a global event that altered the trajectory of two nations and reshaped the world's understanding of power, war, and human endurance. For Vietnam itself, the legacy was both triumph and tragedy. The country was reunified under communist rule, fulfilling a dream pursued through decades of struggle. The long arc of resistance, from French colonization to Japanese occupation to American intervention, had ended in victory for those who sought independence. But the cost was staggering. Millions of Vietnamese had died, the landscape was scarred, and the economy lay in ruins. Post-war Vietnam faced hunger, poverty, and isolation. Trade embargoes and continued conflict, including a bloody war with Cambodia and a border clash with China, deepened the hardships. Families lived with the absence of loved ones and the injuries of survivors. The joy of reunification was tempered by the reality of rebuilding from rubble. The environment itself bore scars that lasted for generations. Bomb craters pocked the countryside, landmines and unexploded ordnance remained hidden dangers, and forests stripped by Agent Orange stood barren. Children were born with deformities linked to chemical exposure. Even decades later, farmers plowing fields unearthed remnants of war. The land carried memory, and every harvest was shadowed by what had been sown during the conflict. For those who fled, the war's legacy was exile. The boat people scattered across the globe, building new communities in America, Canada, Europe, and Australia. They brought with them stories of hardship and resilience, reshaping the cultures of the countries that took them in. Their children and grandchildren carried both pride and pain, pride in survival, pain in the loss of homeland. Vietnamese diaspora communities became living reminders that the war did not simply end. It rippled outward, carried in memory and identity across oceans. For the United States, the legacy was one of doubt and division. More than 58,000 Americans had died, and hundreds of thousands more returned wounded in body or spirit. The war eroded trust in government, leaving behind a deep skepticism toward leaders' promises. The credibility gap that opened during Vietnam reshaped American politics, fueling cynicism that endures today. Presidents and generals no longer commanded unquestioned authority. Citizens demanded accountability, and journalists pursued transparency with new vigor. Militarily, the war forced a reckoning. The assumption that technology and firepower could secure victory was shattered. The US military re-examined its doctrines, shifting focus toward mobility, precision, and limited engagements. 4 years, another Vietnam was the phrase that haunted decision-makers, a caution against becoming bogged down in open-ended wars. And yet, the debates that surrounded later interventions, in the Persian Gulf, in Iraq, in Afghanistan, echoed the same questions raised in Southeast Asia. What are America's goals? How long should it stay? What is the cost of credibility? Culturally, Vietnam became a mirror in which Americans examined themselves. Films, novels, and music returned again and again to the war, each interpretation offering new reflections on courage, madness, loyalty, and betrayal. The image of soldiers trudging through jungles, helicopters hovering over villages, and protesters clashing in city streets became symbols of an era. The Vietnam Veterans Memorial, with its black wall of names, embodied the national effort not to glorify victory but to acknowledge loss. It stood as a place where grief, guilt, and pride could coexist. Globally, the war reshaped perceptions of the United States. Allies questioned its judgment, while adversaries drew lessons from its defeat. The Soviet Union and China claimed vindication, pointing to Vietnam as proof that imperial powers could be resisted. In the developing world, Vietnam inspired movements for independence and resistance, though often at terrible costs. For many nations, the war showed both the limits of US power and the dangers of Cold War rivalry playing out on local soil. The legacy also lay in the lives of individuals. Veterans who struggled with post-traumatic stress, Vietnamese families who rebuilt shattered villages, refugees who forged new identities abroad, each carried their own version of the war. The stories differed, but the pain was shared. The war had left no one untouched, from the rice fields of the Mekong Delta to the suburbs of American cities. As decades passed, efforts at reconciliation began. In the 1990s, the United States and Vietnam normalized diplomatic relations. Former enemies became trading partners. Tourists walked through tunnels once used for war, now preserved as museums. American presidents visited Hanoi, paying respects at memorials. These gestures did not erase the past, but they suggested that the legacy of war could also be one of healing. And yet, the questions linger. What was gained? What was lost? Was the sacrifice justified? For many, the answers remain elusive. Vietnam was a war without simple lessons, its legacy defined not by triumph or defeat alone but by complexity. It taught that wars cannot be measured solely by weapons or strategies, but by the endurance of people and the consequences that echo for generations. Today, Vietnam stands as a reminder of resilience. Its cities are crowded and bustling, its people young and forward-looking. Yet beneath the surface, memory endures. In the United States, too, the war continues to shape politics, culture, and debate. Each new generation confronts Vietnam in textbooks, films, or family stories, learning that its legacy is not a closed chapter but an ongoing conversation. The Vietnam War began as a colonial conflict, grew into a Cold War battlefield, and ended as one of the most painful episodes in modern history. Its legacy lies in ruined villages and rebuilt cities, in names etched on black granite, in families scattered across continents. It lies in cautionary tales told to new presidents, in songs sung in protest, in the quiet grief of veterans, and in the determination of survivors. The war is over, but the legacy endures, a shadow across two nations, a lesson for the world, and a reminder that the true cost of war is measured not in speeches or statistics, but in lives lived and lives lost.